After the last cargo chute touched down, the men began to retrieve their gear. This task normally took a crew this size about 15 minutes to complete, but because the cargo packs were dropped from such a high altitude and had drifted on the wind, they were widely scattered across the upper end of the gulch. It took the crew 45 minutes to an hour to gather up the parachutes and haul the cargo packs to a central location Dodge had selected near the drainage bottom. At about 5 o'clock, after all the gear and parachutes had been gathered up, Foreman Dodge instructed the crew to grab a bite to eat, fill their canteens, and then gather their tools and head up the south side of the canyon to the fire on the ridge. He told them he was going to head up to the fire to tie in with a guy who he heard yelling on the ridge, Jim Harrison. Leaving the crew under Bill Hellman's control, Dodge dropped into the drainage bottom and then headed up the hill for the ridge line and the fire. Though the timber was quite thick on this side of the gulch, Dodge was able to meet up with Harrison in pretty short order. Dodge made a quick assessment of the situation, the heavy fuels and the still aggressive fire behavior, and suggested to Harrison that he follow him and join the smoke jumper crew. Harrison readily agreed. Dodge and Harrison then retraced Dodge's route and headed back down to the cargo assembly area near the draw bottom. However, when they were about halfway down the slope, they encountered the jumper crew headed up to the fire with Hellman in the lead. Dodge later explained to Jansen that he told Hellman that he didn't like the looks of things on the ridge and instructed Bill to take the crew and head them down the gulch to the river. Apparently, Dodge's plan was to attack the fire from the rear with the river safely at his back. Dodge and Harrison then proceeded on to the cargo spot to pick up water and rations. While all this was taking place, Jansen had been busy getting his pickup firefighters in place. Bob had decided the mouth of Mann Gulch was no place for a fire camp, too much brush and too little level ground, and moved the camp upriver to Meriwether. Once there, Jansen quickly dispatched Hersey and his 19 men to the fire at the top of the Meriwether Ridge. The ranger was concerned about Jim Harrison's whereabouts. Jim was supposed to report in on the radio at 3:30, but no one had heard from him. Bob assumed, correctly as it turned out, that Harrison had joined the smoke jumper crew. With the fire camp organized and his firefighters on their way up to the fire, Jansen was free to scout out the fire. Joined now by his boss, Forest Supervisor Moyer, Jansen boated downriver in an attempt to get a look at the base of the fire. But because of the topography between the river and the blaze, all they could see was a growing smoke plume coming up from Mann Gulch. At about 5:02 p.m., after several unsuccessful attempts to scout out the fire, the frustrated ranger instructed his conscripted boat operator to drop him off, alone, at the mouth of Mann Gulch. He began to hike up the drainage bottom to get a better look at the fire and, if possible, make contact with the jumpers. Within a quarter of a mile or so from the river, Bob encountered the edge of the fire, now already burning in the bottom of Mann Gulch. He crossed into the edge of the fire and started picking his way through the burning trees, brush, and grass. In the midst of the raging fire, Jansen thought he heard someone shouting and then maybe the metal clank of a tool on rock. Thinking it might be the smoke jumpers, he pushed on. Finally, though, the heat and smoke were just too much. Jansen turned back down the draw, only to find out he was trapped in the fire. Knowing his only escape was back towards the river, Bob made a run and then dove through a wall of smoke and superheated air. He made it through, but passed out from breathing too much smoke. When he regained consciousness a few minutes later, he was immediately sick and vomited. But after a few minutes, he got back on his feet, picked his way back down through the fire and back down the draw bottom to the boat still waiting for him at the river. Jansen returned to the fire camp, thinking at the time that the smoke jumpers and Harrison had likely abandoned the fire and sought shelter in Willow Creek to the north of Mann Gulch. Meanwhile, in Mann Gulch, it was nearly 5:40 p.m. Dodge and Harrison, after returning briefly to the cargo area, headed down the north side of the gulch to catch up with the rest of the crew. With Bill Hellman in the lead, the crew had strung out into two groups, separated by about 500 feet, still heading for the river. When Dodge was able to catch up with the crew, he pulled the crew together and placed Hellman at the rear. Dodge then took the lead. It's important to recognize that up to this point there had been no real sense of urgency about this fire. The men had just taken a break, eaten a meal, and were walking at a normal pace as they headed for the safety of the river. The boys who survived the fire later said David Navon and another smoke jumper even stopped long enough to take a snapshot of the blaze. There was no great hurry, certainly no panic. Even so, the fact that Dodge had decided to move the crew to the safety of the river and that smoke jumper Navon found the fire's behavior interesting enough to stop and photograph, it always suggested to Bob that the fire was probably already beginning to blow up. After the fire, Wag Dodge would tell Jansen that at about 5:45, still in the lead of the column of men heading for the river, that he started up over a small finger ridge which up to this point had prevented him or the crew from seeing directly to the Missouri. Wag said when he reached the top of this ridge, he looked further down the draw bottom and immediately saw the fire had somehow jumped off the timbered ridge to his left and was burning furiously in the grass and brush below him. Worse still, the fire was now burning uphill directly at the crew. Their escape route to the river was now cut off. Dodge said he immediately halted the line of men behind him. With no time for explanation, Dodge quickly moved to the end of the column and sent Hellman to what was formerly the head of the line. The men did what amounts to an about face, and with Dodge in the lead, they reversed their direction of travel and began to climb obliquely up out of the draw to the northeast. They were headed for the ridge line, uphill, directly away from the fire. With Dodge leading the way, the men hiked up and across the slope for several minutes. But the going was difficult. They were headed up a fairly steep slope, and they were loaded down with tools and other gear. Thick grass obscured loose rocks laying on the hillside, and the men stumbled from time to time. They had only covered a few hundred feet before they encountered the first of 4 scree patches they would have to cross to reach the ridgeline. These scree patches are elongated masses of loose rocks several hundred yards long and 100 to 200 yards wide. The footing in these rock fields is notoriously treacherous because the rocks, varying in size from a fist to a bale of hay, are subject to shifting and moving without warning. Scree patches are a challenge to cross in the best of circumstances. Trying to traverse them quickly, carrying tools and equipment, was a struggle. Adding to the challenge inherent in attempting to move a group of men rapidly across these rock fields was the brush. Thick stands of 9-bark, wild rose, chokecherry, and mountain maple, along with several mature pines, slowed their progress. Keeping the men in an orderly single file became impossible. But now, higher on the slope and more exposed to the southwest winds, the fire's advance accelerated. It quickly burned across the scree fields. The fire was now only 150 to 200 yards behind the men and coming up fast through the deep, well-cured grass and scattered ponderosa pine. The men were still several hundred yards shy of the safety of the ridgetop, and the fire was steadily gaining on them. Within a couple of minutes, at approximately 5:53, Dodge realized that at the rate he and his crew were moving up and across the slope, they were not going to make it to the ridge in safety. He turned to his crew and shouted, "Throw everything away that's heavy!" Hellman, who had now moved from the back of the pack and was now next in line behind Dodge, turned to the crew and repeated the order. Most of the men shed their gear, their shovels, their Pulaskis, the 2 crosscut saws, and the 2 5-gallon water cans they had been carrying. But to some of the crew, at least, the order wasn't clear. They'd been told by Dodge and then Hellman to toss their heavy equipment, but some of the men could see that Dodge and some of the others had kept their hand tools. Confused, Jim Harrison kept his heavy smoke chaser pack and his Pulaski. Dietert retained both his shovel and Pulaski until Walt Rumsey snatched away the shovel and tossed it down the hillside. Fire investigators who toured the fire scene with Wag, Dodge, Jansen, and several others later would report finding the jettisoned equipment at the top of the last of the scree fields the crew had passed through. Much of the jettisoned equipment, but not all, was discovered lying within a rough 100-foot circle. To the investigators, it suggested part of the crew was reasonably together when they dropped their equipment, but it also suggested that other crew members may have already begun separating from Foreman Dodge as they ran up and across the slope in their attempts to escape the fire. After taking a few seconds to drop their gear, the men continued to struggle diagonally up the slope for another 2 minutes. But the pitch of the hillside this close to the ridge line approached 76%. Their legs were beginning to give out, their feet to feel like lead weights, and their lungs began to burn with each breath they drew. By the time the men had emerged from the third scree patch and entered the fourth, their orderly line had disintegrated. What had been an organized crew scrambling in a line up the hill, following their foreman up and across the slope only moments ago, now became 16 men racing along individual escape paths headed away from the advancing flames. The faster individuals, Thole, Navon, McVeigh, and Sherman, began to pull ahead of the rest of the crew. Other smoke jumpers, not as fit and not as fast, found themselves going more across the hillside and not up towards the ridgeline. The men were quickly running out of time and out of options. At somewhere near 5:55 p.m., Dodge and a few of the men broke out of a stringer of trees and into a grassy opening on the steep hillside, about 200 feet shy of the ridgeline. Wag Dodge, without a word to anyone, paused, knelt down, and with matches from a book of paper matches, set fire to the deep grass in front of him. The fire rose up in the dry grass in a matter of seconds and started burning up the slope. Dodge's fire had burned off no more than a 10-foot square space before he stepped over the low flames, turned to those closest to him, and frantically waving his arms, shouted above the noise of the approaching fire, "Up this way! Up this way!" But smoke jumpers Sally, Rumsey, and Dietert, who along with Bill Hellman were closest to Dodge, didn't understand. They thought Dodge intended for his fire to be some sort of a buffer between them and the main fire. They didn't understand he wanted them to get into the blackened and burned area. Reacting on impulse, Sally, Rumsey, and Eldon Dietert ran around the right side of Dodge's still burning escape fire and headed directly upslope for the ridgeline. Bill Hellman was reported to have said, "To hell with that, I'm getting out of here," and he started up the slope for the ridgeline, up the left flank of Dodge's escape fire. The remainder of the crew, those near Dodge and those who had moments earlier made their choices to find their own routes to safety, continued on their own pathways up and across the slope beneath Dodge's fire. But the main fire, pushed by winds and oxygen-rich air from below, was now rapidly moving up and across the slope too. Moving an estimated 600 to 700 feet per minute through the cured grass and scattered trees, the 30 to 40-foot flames rapidly overran the crew, and they were dropped one by one to the hillside. Jim Harrison's pocket watch was stopped at 5:56, and within a minute or maybe two, the rushing fire caught the last of the crew members. Wag Dodge, after jumping into his escape fire and trying unsuccessfully to get the crew to join him, finally lay down, jammed his handkerchief against his nose, and flattened himself against a steep slope as the superheated air, wall of flames and smoke swept over above him. Meanwhile, jumpers Bob Sally, Walt Rumsey, and Eldon Dietert were all approaching the ridge line. They were nearly exhausted from their efforts, but as they approached the crest of the ridge and possible safety, they ran into a nearly vertical wall of rock which ran parallel with the ridge and abruptly blocked their path. Sally and Rumsey turned to the left, searching for an opening in the rock. For some reason, Eldon Dietert turned to the right. Sally and Rumsey, amidst the thick smoke and their near panic, finally found a narrow break in the rock, squeezed through, and scrambled to the top of the ridge. Eldon Dietert never found an opening in the rock and ran to the right, up the gulch another 200 feet before the fire caught him and dropped them to the hillside. Once at the top of the ridge, Sally and Rumsey spotted another long, narrow patch of rocks just off the ridge line and across the slope. They ran for the rocks and scrambled into them. Collapsing, gasping for breath, they had only moments before the flames crested the ridge behind them, came across the slope, and drove them to the bottom of the scree patch. Mere minutes later, another finger of the fire crested the ridge west of their refuge and drove them back up to the top of their island of safety. Like the other men who had decided not to join their foreman in the escape fire, Bill Hellman took his own escape route. Bill ran up the left side of the escape fire and managed to reach the ridge top, only to be caught there by the rapidly moving fire. Though severely burned, Hellman struggled 200 yards off the ridge line and down the other side of what would become known as Rescue Gulch before he collapsed. Back on the Mann Gulch side of the ridge, it was approximately 6:10 p.m. before Wag Dodge could leave his burned-out area. Immediately concerned for his crew, Wag called out and whistled through the thick smoke and the noise of burning trees, stumps, and limbs. Several minutes passed without a response, but finally, as he faced down the slope, he heard a weak cry from below and to his left. Dodge picked his way down and across the hillside through the fire, and at about 6:15 found Joe Sylvia. Sylvia was horribly burned, but still conscious. After tending to Sylvia as best he could, Dodge lifted Sylvia atop a nearby large boulder to protect him from rolling rocks and logs which were still coming down the hillside. He then headed up to the ridge line to look for the rest of his men. While this was playing out, the fire had swept past Bob Sally and Walt Rumsey, and by 6:15 they left their scree patch and began searching for other crew members. 5 minutes later, just downslope from them and a little off to the west, they discovered Bill Hellman. Like Sylvia, Hellman was severely burned. They gave Hellman sips of water from their canteens and offered what little comfort and assurances they could to the injured smoke jumper. After they had propped Bill up against a large boulder and made him as comfortable as possible under the circumstances, Sally made an attempt to climb back up to the ridge top and into Mann Gulch to search for the others, but was forced back by the intensity of the fire. But within minutes, Wag Dodge crested the ridge and worked his way down to them. After taking in Hellman's condition, Dodge told Sally and Rumsey he had another smoke jumper injured on the Mann Gulch side of the ridge. Dodge could only remember the man's name begin with an S. Without a radio, Dodge directed Rumsey to stay with Hellman while he and Sally headed downslope for the Missouri River to find help. Dodge and Sally picked their way through the fire and down the mountainside until they reached the river's edge. Not spotting anyone or anything, and with no map to guide them, Dodge planted his fire shovel in the riverbank, tied his bandana to the handle, and the two turned north and hiked the river's edge for half a mile until they reached the mouth of Elkhorn Creek. Here, the two turned east and followed the creek another half mile or so to find a ranch one of them had spotted from the C-47 before the jump, but they soon realized they were lost. The two turned around and returned to the river's edge where Dodge had left his shovel. Here they heard voices and a dog barking on the other side of the river. They shouted and attracted the attention of some boaters who were watching the fire from the west shore. The boaters gave Dodge and Sally a ride to the Merriweather fire camp. Finally, 2.5 hours after leaving Rumsey with Hellman and Sylvia alone in Mann Gulch, Dodge and Sally, at 8:50 p.m., walk up to the radio shack at Merriweather and ask for the fire boss. Jansen identified himself, and Dodge reported he had 2 injured smoke jumpers up the hill and 11 other men missing.